I'll also dive right into my presentation to make sure that I'm able to finish within the time allotment, and so that we can also have more time for all the discussions later on for all your questions. Okay, so my topic for today is supposed to be about the right to privacy in the online space or in the digital world. But before I do that, I think it's important for us to have a shared understanding first of two key terms, which is privacy and the right to a privacy rather, and then data privacy. Because I'm going to mention these two terms a lot of times uh, during my talk. And then at the same time, a lot of people tend to confuse these two terms with one another. When we're talking about the right to privacy or privacy in general, I think we can safely borrow that definition provided by Justice Brandeis and Samuel Warren in their seminal article on the right to privacy, which is about the right, that this particular right being the right to be let alone, or having this space to ourselves away from the prying eyes of anyone or everyone else, literally and figuratively. So that's the right to privacy. Next, we have data privacy, which is just one of the many manifestations of, well, not too many, but of several manifestations of the right to privacy. So that's data privacy for you. In the EU and in some other jurisdictions, they actually have a different term for it. It's called, or they refer to it as data protection. So as far as data privacy is concerned, it's a person's right to have some semblance of control over his or her personal data. Or to flip it, or stated otherwise, we could also say that it's the right against the unauthorized processing of our personal data. So it's not just about keeping our data away from others. It's making sure our data is protected even while it's in the hands of other people or in the hands of organizations. So these are the two terms that I hope are clear to us as we move along. So they are related terms, but they're not exactly the same. Not all privacy issues are data privacy issues, and vice versa. And so therefore, not all solutions to some privacy issues may be appropriate solutions to some data protection or data privacy issues. Okay, so for my talk this afternoon, I'm going to touch on both of these particular issues. Let me first set the context, because I'm going to focus on the problems or on the threats that we face right now as far as privacy is concerned, as far as our rights to data privacy is concerned in the digital world. So let me first, or let's set the table, so to speak, or set the context. So whenever we say we're now living in a digital world, what do we mean exactly? I think Rommel also touched on this a bit earlier, so I'm just going to add a few numbers, figures, to really illustrate what we mean when we say we are now living in a digital world. So as far back as 2017, so that was around 3 years ago, according to the ITU, International Telecommunication Union, around 46% of households in the world already have a computer. And then 59% of us, people in the world, are now connected to the internet, are now online. And of those of us who do, actually spend now more than 100 days online every year. So imagine how much time we spend online every year. Maybe it's not actively doing something online, but the mere fact that we are connected to the internet, I think that's what they're trying to say. Uh, and then as far as social media is concerned, 50% of the global population are already in social media. Of course, most of us are in Facebook, the biggest of them all. The average time we spend online or on Facebook or on social media rather would be around 2.5 hours per day. Now let's localize somewhat these figures and take a look at what's going on here in the Philippines. So actually Rommel and I have the same reference in some of these figures. So according to one particular source, 67% of Filipinos are now considered active internet users. And we spend actually nearly 10 hours a day. And I'm guessing that this figure will have increased or must have increased ever since March of this year when this pandemic really uh, took its toll on everyone. And then around 73 million Filipinos are active in social media, spending on average 4 hours a day, which is higher than the global average, which is 2.5 hours a day. Oh, by the way, that 9 hours and 45 minutes spent online, that's actually the highest in the world. So apparently, we're the people that spend the most time on the internet. Now, whether or not that's caused by some service or connection issues, I think the speakers next week will have more to say about that. Okay, so with these figures, all these are poised to go up even further. And that is because every day, it seems like we're always finding new ways to connect something that we are doing now, we are using now, to the internet. And this is that phenomenon we refer to as the Internet of Things, which Rommel also mentioned earlier. Now, the second half of the context that I want to establish is how much data, specifically personal data, uh, is playing a huge part in this digital transformation because it is playing a big role. Today, we are producing so much data that just take a look at what is supposedly happening. These are figures given for last year, actually 2019. So these are just some of the figures that they say we get to do within 60 seconds of every of every hour or every minute of every day, any day of the year. So around 18.1 million text messages sent in just 1 minute, 188 million emails sent, 390,000 applications downloaded, and it's just from uh, Google Play and Apple Store. So this is just a snapshot of what of how much data we're actually generating, we are producing every single day. Now, these numbers are sorry, these numbers also are poised to or are supposed to be higher rather if we're going to consider the fact that these are just information we've been able to gather about mostly tech companies. So there are all these other private businesses out there. Then of course there's government. Government also is a big collector of information and processor of information. So if we can consider all those information that these other entities are collecting, generating, and processing, then it's supposed to be bigger. We're supposed to be looking at higher numbers. Now, if you're still not convinced that we're really producing that much information, just consider this one specific, um, I should say, estimate. According to one estimate, if we take all the information that we as a race, the human race, have been able to produce since the very beginning up until the year 2000. So this 2 millennium worth of millennia worth of data. If you can imagine how much information that is, it is said that today we are producing just as much information in less than an hour. So that's how much information we are churning out every second, every minute, every hour of every day. Now, so this explains basically why there is now a growing list of tech companies in the world's top businesses. Because these are the same companies, these are the same organizations that have been successful actually in coming up with uh, essentially a new business model that thrives from the use, from the processing of our personal data, of data in general. Uh, and as far as these companies are concerned, starting in the year 2014, most of them actually are now found here in Asia. So since 2014, there are now more tech companies here in Asia than in the entire United States. So uh, there has also been a shift in terms of the epicenter of where all these new technologies are getting or coming out from, or being developed rather. Okay, so now that we're done with that setup, with the context of where we're going to look at in terms of what problems are we now facing in terms of our right to privacy, in terms of our rights as provided under our data privacy or data protection laws. Let's now proceed to these problems or these issues. Now, there are so many issues, so many problems out there, and I cannot, we won't have enough time, even maybe a semester's worth would be sufficient to discuss all these issues. So what I did was just to come up or to limit my discussion to three main problem areas or themes, uh, wherein and I tried to cram as much of these different issues under these three themes for purposes of our discussion today. So what is the first major problem, first major issue we have in the digital sphere when we're talking about privacy, when we're talking about data privacy? So the first one is how this digital transformation has facilitated the proliferation of so-called data-intensive systems, which by their very nature actually challenge the data protection laws and our very notion of our right to privacy. So what are data-intensive systems? These are systems basically or technologies that operate around the collection and processing of our personal data, especially on large scales. So hindi ito yung paunti-unti lang, but on large scale processing of personal data, of our personal information. So today, because of the digital society, of the digital world that we have, there are so many of these systems now all around us. And I guess we can classify them according to who is behind them. So there are, of course, DIS or data intensive systems being maintained or managed by the private sector. Perhaps the most common or familiar to us are, of course, all these social media platforms and how they have been able to monetize actually our personal data. Another good example for these systems that are being managed by the private sector are all these different products that have been developed by the fintech sector or fintech industry. And perhaps here in the Philippines, the most famous, or should I say infamous, among these products would be all these money lending applications. We all know by now that since last year, we've received so many complaints or problems with respect to these lending apps. But in any case, these are data intensive systems, and what they do essentially is collect all this information about us, not just the traditional kinds of information that lenders collect. So they collect information about how we input the names of our contacts in our phone book. They collect information about how often we use our phones, etc., etc. And they use this actually to profile us. They use this to assign to us our credit score, and that's how they determine if they would like actually to let us borrow some money, and so on and so forth. And of course, as all these news articles have shown, these companies also tend to use all this information for other purposes. Some of them less noble, and some would even, I would say, qualify as criminal. So these are two good examples as far as data intensive systems are concerned in the private sector. Now, if we shift to the government, this is where we will find the more familiar and more traditional information systems that we've come to know. So this is where we find the digital identity system. So right now, our government is rolling out the PhilSys. Now, ordinarily, or in the past rather, national identity systems are not necessarily part of the digital world. But today, they are. That's why in countries that have old identity systems in place, they're coming up with digital identity systems now to upgrade their legacy or their old systems. So we have the Philippines PhilSys, we have India's controversial Aadhaar identity system, and so on and so forth. And then we also have health information exchanges, rather, which is also about sharing of our health information between healthcare providers. We have SIM card registration systems, which is maintained actually in a lot of countries, a lot of other countries. Over here, we don't have one, but it's been proposed essentially every year by our legislators. And then you have unique ones like China's new social credit system. So all these government established and maintained systems are considered data intensive systems. And then finally, we have the last batch, which are more or less the result of collaborations between the private sector and the government. So this is where big data center projects may be found. This is where smart city projects may be found. So over here in the Philippines, for instance, we've had tie-ups between cities like Makati, Davao, and I think Cebu with IBM. We've had, or we currently have, I think, a smart city collaboration also between the city of Taguig and Huawei. Um, and even that Safer Philippines or Safe Philippines project, I think, between DILG and, if I'm not mistaken, Huawei also. So these are also part of smart city initiatives, which are obviously collaborations between the private sector and the government. So all these are what we would refer to as, or what some would refer to as, data intensive systems. Now, when we're talking about data intensive systems, uh, people, those behind them, proponents rather, uh, would always like to highlight their supposed benefits. And these are just some of those benefits that they like to tell us. So they say because of these systems, we have more evidence-based decision making, which essentially says the more information we have, the better decisions we are able to make. So supposedly, this also facilitate better public access to services, not just government services, but even those offered by the private sector. These are supposedly also useful as tools for crime prevention and, to some extent, crime solving. And then as far as the private sector is concerned, of course, they enable private companies to maximize their profits because of this data intensive systems. Now, there is a grain of truth to all this, though I would say that the benefits tend to be exaggerated in most cases. And I think that's what the reason for that is because the proponents of these systems would like us all to focus on those benefits. But like all technologies out there, there's always a flip side. So these technologies, with all the with all the benefits rather that they promise to give us, they also have their baggages. They also have their issues. Now, as far as data intensive systems are concerned, there are several issues out there. Not all of them concern privacy or data privacy. There are several about privacy and data privacy. And if you were to ask me to pinpoint or identify or single out one that would stand out, I think it's how these systems enable the misuse and or the abuse of our personal data. Now, when I say that, so these are just some of the examples that I think most of us are either familiar with or might have heard of in the past couple of years. So we've heard of data intensive systems facilitating new forms of harassment and discrimination, like how, for instance, like how like how China's smart city projects supposedly are being used to control their minority communities, like the Uyghur communities over there in China. We've also heard, or there have been also news reports about China's social credit system, and how and what are the consequences if you happen to uh, become one of those people who violate certain norms or rules there in China, and how you are then profiled by the system, and get to be penalized or punished in so many different ways, whether it's being unable to enroll in certain types of schools, being unable to purchase or enjoy certain types of public transportation, and so on and so forth. So that's as far as government is concerned. When we're talking about the private sector, there have also been all these scattered news reports, stories about the people behind these data-intensive systems making use of the information gathered through these systems and using them for all sorts of purposes. And a lot of them are not good ones. For instance, here you have that Uber executive tracking the movements of particular journalists who happen to have Uber installed on his phone, uh, because I think, if I'm not mistaken, that journalist was not saying a lot of good things about Uber at that time. And then there's this other news report also about other Uber employees using their system to spy on their former lovers, on politicians, and on celebrities. Over here, the violation has not been that high tech, but we've seen also how certain users of their app, or drivers in some cases, in most cases, use the information generated or collected through the app for other purposes, and they have been called out for those types of behavior. And then finally, of course, another good example, if anyone has seen this particular Netflix documentary, The Great Hack, then or better yet, if any one of you is familiar, or followed that news story about Cambridge Analytica, which Rommel also mentioned earlier, then you should also know, or we should also know by now, how actually our personal data uh, shared on a platform like Facebook could actually be used, packaged, and eventually would be weaponized, essentially, and used to undermine democratic institutions like the electoral process. So these are all just a sampling of all the things that happen, or the negative things that happen as a result of data intensive systems, which we can attribute to this digital transformation that we are going through. The second, which I inadvertently already showed earlier, is how digital transformation has also facilitated the steady but steep rise in cybercrimes, specifically those crimes that relate to privacy or which involve personal data. So we can just take a look at all these headlines, for instance, rising incidents in terms of on identity thefts, doxing, harassment, cyberbullying, and then of course, hacking. The most famous, of course, is the Comelec incident that, way back in 2016, which was essentially the very first um, case handled or investigated by the National Privacy Commission. Of course, just this year, we also saw this headline of the NPC itself experiencing its own hacking incident. Although supposedly, according to their reports, there were no personal data involved or affected in that particular occasion. But the bottom line here, and I think what I'm trying to say is that all these things have been made possible because of our shift to the digital sphere, to the digital world. And then finally, the third one is how this digital transformation has also ushered in the emergence of a real life surveillance society. So all that, or that particular dystopian world Orwell in his 1984 novel, uh, we are now seeing it firsthand today. And I think what Edward Snowden showed us way back in 2000, was it 2013, was just to give us a sneak peek on how bad it is already today when we're talking about the surveillance activities being done by the government. And as far as Snowden is concerned, uh, in the spotlight in that particular in his revelations were just the Five Eye, the so-called Five Eye. So that's the U.S., Canada, U.K., Australia, and New Zealand. But basically, all governments carry out their own surveillance activities. Some of them valid for the protection of national sovereignty and so on and so forth. Some of them less so. That being said, if anyone also, or if any one of you have also watched this other Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, if that particular show told us anything, it's that the private sector is just as guilty. So when Edward Snowden came out with all that information, he more or less also showed some aspects there wherein uh, some private sector entities, some tech companies were said to be cooperating actually with the government, with government spying institutions. But as far as the social dilemma is concerned, this particular documentary is concerned, it focused on the surveillance activities, mechanisms also, or rather, that are being perpetrated by the uh, tech companies, by the private sector entities on their own, for their own benefit. So private companies tend to build their surveillance mechanisms into their platforms, into their systems, while governments on the other hand like to keep it secret, or they actually try to justify or legitimize it through laws and justify it through boilerplate justifications like protection of national security, necessary for public order and public safety, and so on and so forth. And this is why we have all these controversial laws like the Anti-Terrorism Act. We have the implementing rules of the Cybercrime Prevention Act. Rommel mentioned earlier about that particular Supreme Court case striking down the real-time collection of personal data, but that was somehow revived in the implementing rules for a time that was supposed to be unlawful or unconstitutional. But ever since our country signed into the cybercrime Budapest Cybercrime Convention, I think that has more or less been that defect has more or less been somewhat cured by that particular treaty. Yeah. So moving forward, I've also identified some contributing factors in terms of these how these problems we have now are are, are being confronted. So these factors make it more difficult for us to address those three key problems that I identified. So what are these contributing factors? First is you have your lack of effective laws or regulation. So although the list of countries with data protection laws is growing, I think every couple of months, there are still many out there who don't have one. And for those who have one, like ours, there are still quite a lot of policy gaps to fill. So that falls with on the shoulders rather of regulators or the data protection authorities. And then there's also the fact that in some cases we have a law. It's just that the regulator or the implementing agency is weak as far as implementing it is concerned. Now, weakness can be manifested in so many ways. It may be weak because it may not have the necessary powers to carry out its mandate. It may be weak because it lacks manpower, it lacks resources, funding, or it could also be weak because it lacks the necessary competence or expertise to actually perform its job. And then finally, you have regulatory capture. So in this case, you may have a law in place, you may have what is arguably a competent regulator. It just so happens that it has been compromise. So what frequently happens is when your regulators cozy up to the very same entities they are supposed to watch over, then they effectively become useless. And here in our country, I think there are certain regulators that uh, civil society and consumer groups readily identify as supposedly subject to this, or subject rather to regulatory capture. Okay, now finally, let's proceed to how then do we deal with all these problems. If you have those many problems aggravated or made worse by all these contributing factors, what do we now do? So I've listed down um, four, and I know they sound like uh, motherhood statements. But later, if we have the time, I'll be more than happy to discuss them more in detail. But these are the four that I was able to identify. First, we have to make sure that all these technologies are always grounded in law. That means, especially for those created and mandated by government, we have to make sure that there are necessary safeguards in place as far as those laws are concerned, with a healthy amount of transparency also. So hindi pwedeng napaka-opaque how these systems are being managed or being operated. Of course, all these technologies also must be compliant with privacy and data protection laws, such as they should recognize data subject rights. They should prescribe mandatory data breach notification protocols. The second one is for us to have an effective oversight by a competent and independent regulators. And I would even go further and say the judiciary as well. They must also be competent in that regard. In the same way that we are educating our judiciary as far as cybersecurity, cybercrime are concerned, I think we should also be doing the same for data privacy. And I think that STC case is a good example of why we need to do that. Um, so regulators need to be given the necessary powers. They need to be given the necessary resources to perform their job. But at the same time, they have to be effective in performing their job as well. They need to make sure rather that they are competent enough to perform their functions. And they should now not allow themselves to be compromised and used by those with vested interests. Third would be for there to be always an active and vocal civil society. So whether it's NGOs, the media, and even academic institutions, we need to be ready to assist the government, regulators, whenever they need our assistance. But at the same time, we have to be ready to keep them in check in cases there are abuses. We, as that age-old adage says, we need to continue speaking truth to power. Tell the government when it has overstepped its mandate. And as far as the government is concerned, it needs to be open-minded and welcome all these criticisms, not shun them, not set them aside, because that's the only way for all these problems to be properly addressed moving forward. And then finally, us as individuals, we also need to be empowered as citizens, especially as data subjects. So we need to be aware of all these laws, applicable laws and relevant laws that govern privacy, data privacy, especially in the way they relate to technologies. And be ready also, especially those that actually give us rights. And then whenever necessary, we also have to be prepared to exercise those rights, even when it's not that convenient for all of us, such as filing cases. If we may think that it may require too much work, but if that's what's necessary to make sure that companies are actually complying with all these laws, these policies, then we need to be prepared to do that. Okay, so I'm going to end there. I just have one slide left. I started this discussion by setting a common understanding of what we mean by the terms privacy and data privacy or data protection. And I'd like also to end with a shared belief among all of us as citizens, as data subjects, in terms of how we should approach technology. And that common belief is this: we should, as a people, believe that technology actually exists to augment our weaknesses. It's not supposed to take advantage of our weaknesses. If you watch again that social dilemma, you would know more what I'm talking about. So as citizens, we need to make sure that these technologies actually guarantee our rights or even enhances them rather than undermines those rights. And then together, we should also believe that true progress, the kind that is promised by a digital future, a digital world, should never be at the expense of our fundamental rights, such as the right to privacy and the right to data privacy. That's it.